I was extremely surprised. I woke up on the Friday morning, having gone to bed the previous night, feeling fairly relaxed about the outcome, and when I woke up I saw Farage's grinning face, which immediately told me that the result hadn't gone the way I and many other people expected it to. So my feelings were of surprise and sort of incredulity, really. At the same time, though, we are living in this very peculiar age when the unexpected seems to happen more and more often. So one part of me, at least, perhaps on some level, had been expecting this or something strange to happen. During the campaign, sometimes I had a feeling that Britain might vote to leave. Mainly because the people fronting the Leave campaign were so unpopular and went about advocating the cause of the EU in such a hapless and confused way, never mentioning its benefits, almost trying to make a point of not discussing the topic of the EU and Britain's membership within the EU openly. So I was a little bit surprised during the campaign itself by the way in which the Remain camp supported the idea of staying in the EU, and that in some ways perhaps gave me some presentiment of what could happen on the 23rd of June. So I was surprised when I woke up on the 24th of June, but one part of me perhaps wasn't so surprised after such a lackluster and unconvincing campaign. And another factor that troubled me during the campaign itself was the unpopularity of someone like Cameron. Why would people living in Middlesbrough, for instance, or Hull, really want to endorse something being put forward and propagated by someone like David Cameron? Then you also had Corbyn, whose commitment to the EU has always been rather flimsy. He too didn't make much of a fist of it. Then, of course, on the same scale perhaps as Cameron, you had people like Clegg, totally discredited by their association with the Tory party, also proving very incapable and even incompetent in putting forward ideas in favour of Britain's membership within the EU. The result has in some ways certainly affected my attitude towards how I see Britain. Again, though, in some ways I perhaps had some presentiments about the events that have emerged from Brexit over the last 3 years. For instance, I was always very aware of the imbalance in power between England and Scotland, for instance, and things like that have become shown much more starkly since the result. Before 2016, one always had the feeling of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland being bossed around by England. This was something I always felt in my marrow, but over the last 3 years this has become absolutely clear as day, which is one reason why so many people in Scotland now favour the idea of Scottish independence. The idea that people who voted by a very clear margin to stay in the EU are nonetheless being driven out of the EU by the power of England, demographically and politically, is certainly very difficult to swallow as a possibility. And so that power dynamic in Britain between the four constituent members of the UK, it was always an issue for me before 2016, but now it's absolutely clear that there is a huge discrepancy there, demographically and in terms of political power between those four member states. And it seems to me an outrageous injustice that Northern Ireland and Scotland, both voting to stay in the EU by a very clear margin, and nonetheless being railroaded into leaving by the likes of Boris Johnson and people like him from the southeast of England, who have no interest in Scotland and no appreciation of it, and they also incidentally don't seem to care very much about what happens in Northern Ireland, whereas we know the political situations are extremely fragile. An event yesterday proved that with a bomb going off on the border. That doesn't seem to matter. So this perception I've always had on some level of English arrogance and insensitivity and indifference, I would say it's now much more obvious to me that this is indeed the case. So that certainly changed my attitude towards Britain. In addition, I'm probably now much more inclined to see England anyway as a more xenophobic, intolerant country. So you could mention many examples of this. I mean, one occurred last year when the Polish War Memorial in Hammersmith, which has been there since the 1960s, was vandalized by hooligans, obviously in favour of Brexit, or it's very likely that they were, who probably were so stupid that they believed that Polish War Memorial had been established there, 3 or 4 years ago. That kind of intolerance, xenophobia, things like that. In Britain in the past, it would have been more veiled. It certainly existed, and sometimes it would have been just as violent and as unpleasant as it was in the example I mentioned. But now that kind of xenophobia, as with the other instances I've mentioned, it seems much more stark, much more obvious now than it used to be. I always had a notion of Britain being a rather curious and eccentric country with a sort of dysfunctional political system. This has been my belief for many years, but this was not how Britain was seen by people in Germany or Poland or Ukraine or other countries I know well. Their perception of Britain before 2016 wasn't one I agreed with, but it was a very strong perception of the country as stable, sensible and a mature democracy, to use that term. And that view of Britain, established for a very long time, has now obviously come completely asunder over the last 3 years. And I haven't met anyone in Germany who seems to think Brexit is a sensible idea. Their response to Brexit is one of astonishment, really, that a country is willing to do this to itself, seemingly. So Britain's standing in the world and how it's seen by other countries has been massively altered by Brexit, entirely for the worse, in my opinion. The country seems to be embarked on a quixotic, dangerous pursuit, which, in the views of most people, I think, on the planet, will lead only to disaster. The people who favour Brexit are doing so for entirely self-interested reasons. So Vladimir Putin, for instance, thinks it's a great idea. Well, anything considered to be a great idea by Putin should certainly be viewed with great skepticism. And yet millions of people in Britain seem oblivious of whatever agenda Putin might have had in distorting the outcome of the vote 3 years ago. The same is true of Trump. Why would this man want Brexit to happen? Well, because he and his comrades, his allies, realise that Britain will be enfeebled and very much at the mercy of the Republican administration when it comes to signing any trade deal. So these, as far as I can see, perhaps along with people like Matteo Salvini in Italy, these are the only people who think Brexit's a good idea outside Britain itself. Now, as I suggested, for people like that to think it's a good idea surely makes you wonder. As to whether or not I needed a German passport, I was actually very against the idea for a long time and for many reasons. I have quite a few issues, I suppose, with becoming a German citizen. And yet ultimately it was, as some people put it, a no-brainer. I wouldn't have ever become a German citizen without Brexit. I had no desire to become a German citizen, nor any need to become one. However, the Brexit situation altered everything. It took me a long time to embark upon the procedure to become a German citizen, and there are several anxieties I had about this. For instance, what seemed to be quite a stringent language test. My German is really not very good at all, and I was worried about being humiliated in front of Prussian bureaucrats who perhaps thought my German was lamentable. So things like that made it that bit harder to embark on this procedure. But actually I was extremely lucky with the part of Berlin I live in. Schöneberg, which is where I live, made it extraordinarily easy for me. They seem to attach a lot of significance to the fact I've lived in the country for a long time. They didn't put any obstacles in my path at all. People living elsewhere in Berlin, and definitely outside Berlin in Brandenburg, have had real issues and real problems in securing a German passport. However, in my case, Schöneberg Amt, to their great credit, and I'm very grateful to them for this, made it very, very straightforward indeed for me to get a German passport. And another factor that really spurred me finally into acting was I'm actually in a position, at the moment anyway, where I can retain my British passport as well as having a German passport. And there was a lot of, there still is a lot of uncertainty about one's status, and something that disconcerted me a lot was the idea of perhaps having to choose between a German and a British passport. As things stand, I'm able to have both. If a situation arises where I have to choose between my passports, well, it's going to be very difficult indeed. And some people seem to think this is quite likely, that one will have to choose. And in terms of the usefulness of the German passport, it's going to vastly outweigh, I suspect, having a British passport. With a British passport, where will you be able to work? Where will you be able to live without all sorts of bureaucratic complications? Well, probably nowhere. With a German passport, on the other hand, I'm likely to have access to 26 or 27 different countries, in any one of which I could live without any bureaucratic hassle at all. So it does pain me a little bit to think this, but if I do have to make that choice, why would you actually want a British passport these days after Brexit? If I could come up with just one or two words to describe my feelings about Brexit, one of them is probably deracinated. You know, I do feel, well, this country that I do see as my homeland in many ways no longer is, or at least England doesn't feel like my homeland. I often think about going back to Britain, but I would really struggle to live in England now. Certain parts of England which are very dear to me, like Hull, for instance, where I went to university, voted by a huge margin to leave the EU, and things like that do sort of leave me feeling very cut off from certain places I rather treasure in my memory. And another word that sums up my feelings, I suppose, is outraged. You know, I am outraged that this vote over 3 years ago now is held up as if it was some definitive judgment made by the British people, when the campaign in favour of leaving the EU was conducted by charlatans and fraudsters, liars, almost to a man. These scoundrels have been not punished for what they did, but awarded with promotions to, in one case, running the country. One's feelings, I suppose, can only be of outrage. Adding to that sense of outrage is also the manipulation of the vote through scoundrels like Cummings, and also through the interference of a hostile power. Now, Putin definitely affected the American elections. He definitely affected, thanks to his bots and their base in St. Petersburg, he definitely affected the outcome of the Brexit vote. My outrage is partly because the Americans have at least investigated Putin's role in Trump's victory. The British, in this casual, lackadaisical, feckless way, have failed to investigate the role of Putin's money in the outcome of the Brexit vote. Cummings refuses to appear before an inquiry, trying to ascertain what happened. Nothing is done to him. He gets away with it, just as Johnson, who, as we know, is a charlatan and liar, is rewarded by becoming Prime Minister. So Cummings is rewarded by being given one of the most senior positions in Johnson's government. So what else could one feel, really, apart from outrage? At times I wonder if Brexit will actually happen. It's presented all the time in the media as if it were a fait accompli. But the harm it's going to inflict on the country, especially if it is the kind of Brexit that now seems likely under Johnson, is of such magnitude. If the opponents of Brexit have any wit and any ability to strike a deal among themselves, surely they can stop it. The problem then, of course, is that there will be lots of people, the 17 million we're always told about, 17.3 million, I believe, will be left feeling outraged, to use that word again, about being cheated out of their Brexit. And this is a problem, of course. So it's going to take an enormous amount of work to patch up these terrible impacts that Brexit has had. The authors of this had no idea of what they were inflicting on the country, Cameron and others, when they gave us Brexit. The harm is incalculable, and perhaps the only way out of this mess is to cancel it as quickly as one can, and certainly to prevent this disaster that Johnson seems happy to impose on the country. But then there will have to be some kind of committees held to investigate just what on earth should be done. Gordon Brown and a few others have suggested that there could be sort of people's tribunals or people's committees held across the country to try and work out some approach to Brexit that reflects the feelings of the people who voted for it, as well as the enormous misgivings of those who didn't, based on so many revelations over the last 3 years, and also on the knowledge so many people have that Brexit will lead to catastrophe unless it's stopped.